Hello everybody. What a fine collection of papers. What excellent research. My name's Nick Ellis. I'm the discussant for this colloquium on implicit language aptitude. It's a pleasure to be with you. In preparing for this, I've been using the presenters' written papers rather than their PowerPoints. There's a lot to talk about. I'm going to go quite quickly. I hope that you're able to recap, because this is a recorded presentation, if I go too fast. I apologize for any errors of interpretation on my part. It is wonderful to be thinking about this. It's wonderful to be thinking about this colloquium on implicit language aptitude. Why? It's going to be thinking about the construct, the measures, and the evidence. Why is it timely to be thinking about this? We've been worried about implicit language learning in the field for 30 years or more. We've recognized that the vast majority of the knowledge that, allows us to be fluent in our language processing has been acquired on the task of processing language, has been acquired implicitly. 25 years ago, there was this collection on implicit and explicit language learning. About 5 years ago, there was this collection. The frequency paper that I did in 2002 was arguing that the psycholinguistic research in all of the different domains of language, phonology, lexis, morphosyntax, syntax, fluent language processing, in all of these domains, we're tuned by our language experience. So what this symposium is about is what is the nature of the implicit learning that allows us to do that learning from processing language. And these 5 papers are cutting edge research, which I think are very exciting in their implications. It's a really well conceived project. It's a convergence of psychometric, cognitive, and linguistic research, tremendous methodological sophistication, non-trivial sample sizes, key questions in second language acquisition, some consistent take-home messages. Despite the difficulties of doing this research, implicit learning is hard, aptitude is hard, aptitude treatment interactions are difficult to do. I'm going to take you through each of the papers in turn and pull out what I find to be the major implications. I'm not going to describe the methods in detail. You've already seen these methods. I want to pull out from each, find the common findings, and then spend 5 or 6 minutes at the end talking about what I see to be the implications. So the first paper, 131 ESL learners, looking at the contributions of implicit statistical learning on implicit second language knowledge. The first key point is that they managed to get reliable measures of implicit learning, so decent reliabilities. They were then interested in, for these 4 different tests of implicit learning, do they converge? Is there one implicit language learning ability? And if you look at their correlations, the answer is no, there isn't. There is a lack of convergent validity, all hovering around 0 here, a lack of convergent validity on these measures of implicit statistical learning aptitude. The next question was, do these implicit learning aptitudes predict language knowledge, either explicit language knowledge or particularly implicit language knowledge? And they had a wide variety of implicit knowledge tests. So do these 4 implicit aptitudes predict implicit knowledge? And on the whole, they do not. Again, we have a correlation matrix filled with zeros. The only association in the correlation matrix that I can see is between the alternating serial reaction time task and word monitoring as a speeded test of language recognition, but it's on its own, and it's difficult data. When they pooled the language knowledge tests and had two factors of language knowledge, an implicit and an explicit factor of language knowledge, the serial learning aptitude tests didn't do anything. The Tower of London didn't do anything. The only thing that was there, is an association between ASRT and this implicit factor. So, paper 2, looking at syntactic priming as a measure of implicit learning, and that's really clever. And they're looking at syntactic priming effects in the native language, so highly skilled language processing in these Chinese participants. Does syntactic priming predict any aspect of their English language learning? They had a variety of explicit aptitude tests. They had a variety of implicit aptitude tests, priming, sequence learning again, and Llama-D. They expected this factor structure. What did they get? 166 CFL learners, fantastic. Did they get convergence of the explicit tests? Yes, they did. Did they get convergence of the implicit tests? No, they didn't. They did indeed get a dissociation between two of the implicit tests and explicit aptitude, but Llama-D loaded on the explicit test, and these two measures here did not predict anything to do with English implicit language knowledge. The third research question was looking at this Llama-D test, which has been used in the past as an index of incidental learning. 60 participants, made the instructions more incidental, added reaction time and confidence ratings. What did they find? They found that Llama-D had low reliability. It just about squeezed in as acceptable if you just looked at the old items. When they looked at performance, then confidence ratings predicted reaction time and accuracy, suggesting that this was more an explicit test. The only correlation with performance of Llama-D and implicit language processing was with not RT, not with accuracy, but the coefficient of variation predicted oral fluency, and it's just scraping in as significant. Paper 4, looking at implicit and explicitness in cognitive abilities and the interaction in predicting different types of feedback in learners. 112 learners, 3 groups, an implicit feedback group, an explicit feedback group, a control group, 2 well attested language aptitude batteries, looking to see if ability on these language aptitude tests predicts language acquisition. The aptitude tests had some of them low reliability. Were there correlations between implicit learning ability and picking up implicit feedback rather than explicit feedback? Yes. Were there associations between explicit learning ability and picking up implicit or explicit feedback? Explicit learning ability seems to have correlated more with explicit feedback. Interesting research. I'm interested in whether or not the uptake from recasts really was implicit. I think there needs to be more of a treatment check of what's going on in the implicit and explicit feedbacks. And there's an awful number of statistical analyses here with not a huge amount of power, but really interesting, really hard work. Finally, the final paper, 119 people looking at the reliability and convergent and discriminant validity of three different procedural memory tasks and 3 different declarative memory tasks. Is there a coherent implicit memory aptitude or procedural memory aptitude? Same old story, lack of convergent validity between the 3 measures. There is not a unitary implicit statistical learning aptitude. And is the patterning of the 4 tests similar? Well, no, 3 of the tests go together. And the weather prediction test loads much more on the explicit tests. So fantastic research. What's the take-home message from them all? Well, the positive take-home message, I think, is it's difficult to get reliable measures of implicit learning, but with care it can be done. The different implicit measures do not show convergence. Explicit measures do tend to load on one factor that is separate from implicit language knowledge. Does implicit aptitude generally predict implicit or explicit language knowledge? Yeah, not much. Maybe in paper 1, maybe in paper 4, but the findings are not terribly robust, I don't think. Negative half-empty considerations. Some of the studies are still underpowered, the effects are small. There are too many statistical steps, harkable choice points in the statistical analyses. It would be lovely to see which of these findings replicates. But this is such a good first step. Need for further conceptual clarity? Yeah, need for further conceptual clarity. The same task, serial reaction time, is sometimes called implicit learning, sometimes implicit aptitude, sometimes procedural learning. We are not alone in doing this sort of research. There's a lot of excitement. It's being done to see if there is implicit learning deficit in specific language impairment. There's a lot of excitement about first and second language learning ability, individual differences in those learnings. The work on an implicit learning aptitude shows that you can get reasonable retest stability over a week, but same findings, lack of convergence of these different tests. Do these different tests predict, are they separate from traditional IQ and working memory tests? Yes, they are. They don't predict those things at all. And same findings in the research as well on being clear about what these different tests measure. So serial reaction time is sometimes called sequence learning, sometimes statistical learning, sometimes visual statistical learning, sometimes implicit learning. We've got some work to do to find out what's going on here. And these different tests differ on so many different dimensions: modality, the nature of the material, the nature of the statistical dependencies. There's a lot of work still to be done. If there are various types of implicit learning aptitude, are they by modality? Probably. Are they by dependency type? Probably. Are they by whether or not the things that you're learning are symbolic or non-symbolic? Almost certainly. Are they dependent on domain of language? Yes, probably. Are they dependent on the saliency of the material to be learned? I believe so. I believe, for me, the most important thing here is the take-home message here is what's relevant is not statistical learning per se, it's statistical learning of things that are important to us. Learning is never content-free, but aptitude actually assumes it is. New knowledge always builds on old knowledge. Content trumps learning process. What you see in front of you here is some content. You have rich patterned knowledge of that content. There is exquisite statistical structure here, both local and longer distant. You know these patterns as a result of thousands of hours on task, but you just can't see it at the moment in this form. But in this form, the same thing. You might start to see some better patterns, some more recognizable patterns. And in this form, well, you can see it absolutely fine. The point is that statistical learning is over things that we have already experienced, things that are important, language representations. Here are two problem spaces, an English problem space and a French problem space. What we're doing as we read these papers is deep learning of these materials. Implicit learning, deep learning, convoluted neural networks can now do face recognition, as we very well know from the media. And what's happening is over multiple convoluted layers, it's picking up, these models are picking up local features and then combinations of these features and eventually face features. Does that work for language? Yes, it does. Here is a deep learning system which matches human professionals in the translation of English into Czech. So I think that as we're looking at these problem spaces, what we're doing is building more and more sophisticated representations of the connections between things that we already know about. I think of this as learning features of the input. Other people think about this as procedural learning. Let me give you one final English problem space. Here it is. We land in London. We want to find out more about London. We go on a trip. We go on another trip. We go on another run. 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 And eventually, over time, we develop this rich procedural knowledge of London. But what have we learned here? We've learned the relations between the key features of London. Think of a French problem space and landing in Rue Suget and doing the same thing there. And over time, all of this processing of language gives us a rich map of the key features of Paris. But what we have here are not go left and go right. What we have are the procedures which connect the important features of London or of France, of Paris. This is what I think implicit learning is about. Implicit learning is never content free. The content is critically important. Thank you for letting me think about this.